Here is the calculation almost nobody actually does. You are 60 years old. You've saved $1 million. Dollars. Your projections say you need $1.2 million dollars to retire. So you decide to keep working 2 more years. Seems reasonable, right? But here's where the numbers shift the whole story. A 65-year-old man in the United States, according to CDC data released in January 2026, has about 18.4 years of remaining life expectancy. That sounds like a long runway. Yet out of those 18.4 years, research based on Medicare data shows that only roughly 14 are what actuaries consider active years. Years without major functional limitations. Years when you can travel, chase grandkids, hike, and physically do the things that give retirement its texture. After that, the calendar keeps advancing, but the quality of those years shrinks. So here's the real trade-off you're making when you choose to work 2, 3, or 5 extra years beyond your financial independence point. You're not merely padding a balance sheet. You are spending years from a window that is tighter than you assume. And that second window doesn't pause while you optimize spreadsheets. Working 5 additional years beyond the point where you could have stopped consumes about 35% of your entire active retirement window. Not in theory, right now, gone. What makes this more than just a quirky math fact is this. Those years you're burning are in your early retirement zone, your 60s, which are objectively the prime years of that window. You are using your healthiest retirement years to earn money you may never truly put to use, just so the balance looks bigger during later years when your spending naturally declines. That exact trade-off is what this video is about. Stick with me, because buried in all of this is a number that applies directly to you, and the method to find it isn't complicated once you see all the moving parts together. Most financial guidance talks about retirement almost entirely in terms of money. Save more, withdraw less, make your money last. But retirement is actually built on 2 currencies, dollars and years. If you optimize purely for dollars, you will, very efficiently and very rationally, end up overspending years on accumulation and underspending them on living. Not because you're foolish, but because the system is only measuring one of the currencies. So that's what you focus on. By the time we're done, I want you to have a 2-axis framework. Not a comforting round target, but a concrete number in years after which working longer stops making economic sense and starts costing you something you can't replace. Picture it this way. Your retirement savings is like a parking meter. You drop coins in throughout your career. Contributions, investment growth, employer matches. Eventually, you've put in enough coins to cover all the time you need. That's your enough point. That's when you could park the car and leave it. But that's not when most people walk away. They keep feeding the meter, not because it's about to expire, it's not. The meter is already fully paid. They keep feeding it because that habit is 30 years old and stopping feels wrong. Stopping feels like negligence. Meanwhile, there's another meter you can't see. It started the day you were born and it's counting down your healthy, active years whether you're at your desk or on a beach. When that second meter runs out, there are no refunds for the time you never spent. Both meters are running. The only question is which one you're looking at. I'm going to keep coming back to that parking meter image because it does something pure financial math doesn't do. It puts both currencies, money and time, on the same screen. Once you see it that way, the default advice to work as long as you can looks very different. In a few minutes, I'll walk through the active years math. The actual number of high-quality retirement years you likely have left at different retirement ages. The number is smaller than you probably think. But before that, I need to walk through something most advisors don't lead with because it disrupts the just keep saving storyline. It's the answer to a simple question. Who actually controls your retirement date? Let me introduce you to someone I'll call David. He's 54. He's stuck with the same employer for 17 years, climbed to a senior director role, built a strong 401k, owns a car outright, and has kids almost through college. He tells himself and his spouse that he'll retire at 62. 8 more years. It looks like a tight plan. Here's the hidden issue. A joint study by ProPublica and the Urban Institute tracked nearly 20,000 Americans starting at age 50 and following them through their later working years. It found that 56% of workers over 50 who hold stable, full-time, long-term jobs lose those positions involuntarily before they reach their chosen retirement date. 28% get hit with at least one harmful layoff. Another 13% stop working under conditions that strongly hint they were pushed out. Survey responses show them expecting to work longer, and then within 2 years reporting retirement alongside a steep earnings drop. An additional 15% leave after their working situation deteriorates. Big pay cuts, stripped responsibilities, or treatment that makes staying impossible. On paper, that's voluntary. In reality, it's a forced hand. Put those segments together. More than half, 56%, of people like David don't get to pick when they exit. A 2025 survey from the Employee Benefit Research Institute found that events fully outside the worker's control explained 76% of all unplanned early retirements. Health issues, layoffs, and caregiving duties are the top three drivers. None of them involve sitting down calmly with a spreadsheet and saying, "We're ready." This is the flip that upends the work more years for safety argument. You think the main risk is pulling the plug too early. In reality, the main risk is not being in charge of when you have to stop. If your entire financial architecture assumes you'll work until 67, you're effectively betting you're inside the 44% who actually get to choose their exit. Yet 58% of workers retire earlier than planned, mostly because life forces the issue, and the median age they stop is 62, 3 years before the classic 65. David's story played out like this. He was laid off at 57. Corporate restructuring, polite goodbye, handshake, 4 months of severance and benefits. He spent 14 months searching for an equivalent role. Eventually, he accepted a job that paid 60% of his old salary and retired at 61, 1 year earlier than planned, with significantly less than his model assumed, and in a much worse spot than he would have been if he'd built his plan around a possible exit at 57 instead of banking on 62. His story isn't an outlier. It's close to the average story. The parking meter on his work life expired at 57. He had planned for 62. The coins he assumed he'd be able to put in weren't there. And the second meter, the one counting down his active, healthy years, kept ticking the whole time. Now, here's the section that reshapes how you should think about retirement timing. The active years math. I mentioned it at the beginning. Let's lay it out fully. Fresh CDC data from early 2026 shows that a 65-year-old in the U.S. can expect to live nearly 2 more decades. Life expectancy at 65 for the total population was 19.7 additional years in 2024. For men, life expectancy at 65 was 18.4 years in 2024. On the surface, that looks like a long retirement, but life expectancy and active life expectancy are not synonyms. Medical research using Medicare cohorts shows that among 65-year-olds who start with no major functional impairments, the healthy group we're really talking about, active life expectancy averages about 14 years. Those are the years when you can go on trips, tackle physical goals, stay fully engaged. After that threshold, the data show a steady rise in limitations. You're still living, but the nature of those years shifts. More medical needs, less mobility, more sitting, more doing less. Not automatically bad years, but different, and often more expensive to enjoy. Here's what that means for the just work extra decision. Social Security Administration. Actuarial tables say a 65-year-old man now has a 50% chance of reaching 84. Roughly 1 in 4 people who reach 65 will cross age 90. So we tend to plan financially for 20-plus retirement years. Yet if only around 14 of those are peak quality, high mobility, high capacity years, then your truly meaningful retirement window is closer to 14 years than 20. Now test the trade. If you work an additional 3 years beyond your financial independence point, from 62 to 65 for example, you're spending 21% of your active retirement window beefing up a portfolio that was already adequate. Not 21% of your remaining life. 21% of the years when you can actually use that money with full energy and capacity. Work an extra 5 years, from 60 to 65, and you've just spent 35% of that premium window. The harsh part is this. Those are your 60s. They are not interchangeable with your 70s. At 62, you recover faster, move better, think more flexibly, and generally have more resilient health than at 72. You're sacrificing the highest quality years in your retirement window for marginal gains in a balance that, according to most well-built models, is already enough. I've watched this personally. A friend, I'll call him Greg, reached financial independence at 58. Rental income, a portfolio at his target, fully paid off house, no dependents left at home. He stayed at his job. He's now 64. For 6 years, he's been repeating, just one more year. His accounts are far above any reasonable requirement. And last winter, for the first time, knee trouble turned a bucket list hiking trip he'd dreamed about for 15 years into a real challenge. He went, and it was meaningful, but it wasn't the trip it would have been at 58. That is a hard, real cost. It just doesn't appear on a statement. A large-scale Dutch study using population-level administrative data found that early retirement reduced mortality among men by 2.5 percentage points. Another study tracking workers for 36 years found that time spent in high-risk occupations was linked to a 55% higher risk of death, and each extra year in such a job increased the odds of distress by 5%. You can reasonably question cause and effect. Perhaps healthier people retire early, but across multiple countries and datasets, the direction of the signal is consistent. Less stress and more control over your time have measurable biological impact. The meter is ticking. You don't get to repurchase those years once you've traded them for slightly larger figures on a screen. Here's the piece. Almost no retirement calculator includes. Knowing about active life expectancy, forced exits, and the limited marginal benefit of extra work years is one thing. Constructing a plan that actually incorporates all of that is something else. The gap between understanding the concept and having a specific exit date, not someday when I feel ready, but an actual number, is where most people linger for years. I put together a digital book called The Exit Code, 8 chapters, 5 decades of real retirement data, no fluff. There are 2 components that connect directly to what we're talking about. First, the 58% rule, the statistical reality that most people stop working earlier than they plan, and the precise buffer structure you need so that a layoff at 57 doesn't blow up your whole plan. Second, the dynamic withdrawal method, which replaces a fixed 4% rule with a strategy built specifically around the sequence of returns risk I'll explain in a moment. Because working extra years is not the lever that protects you from that risk, and most people have never been shown what is. You can grab the exit code for less than you'd pay for 1 hour with a mediocre advisor via the link in the description. Every year you postpone creating a real math-driven exit framework is a year the second meter keeps counting down while the first one sits topped off. Here's something that surprised me when I dug into research about why people who are already financially independent keep working. I assumed the main story would be, they don't actually have enough. They're just being cautious. But in many cases, the explanation is completely different. There's a pattern so common in the financial independence world, it has its own shorthand. One more year syndrome, or OMYS. It's one of the most logical sounding and most financially costly psychological traps out there. Here's how it usually plays out. You run your numbers and hit your target. Your 401k gets to the figure your model says supports a safe 4% withdrawal rate. Technically, you could walk away today, but you don't. You talk yourself into staying on for just one more year. The reasons sound sensible. Maybe markets look frothy and you want to wait for a downturn. Maybe medical costs are rising and your healthcare estimates feel shaky. Maybe your youngest is just starting college. Maybe, and this is the honest version, you're scared. You've been in accumulation mode for 30 years. Decumulation feels like an alien problem, and it is a different game. So you continue one more year. At the end of that year, your enough line has moved. There's a new justification. Maybe markets dipped and now you want to rebuild to your prior high. Maybe markets soared and you've mentally anchored to the new bigger number as your minimum. Or there's a major project you want to finish. Or corporate changes are coming and you want to see how they play out. There is always a reason. There will always be a reason. The reasons generate themselves. Now, let's put hard numbers on this because the math is not what most people expect. Say you're sitting on $1.2 million, dollars, contribute $50,000 more in the next year, and markets return 7%. In one additional year, you end up around $1.34 million. dollars. That's real, an extra $140,000. But what does that $140,000 buy you in practical retirement terms? At a 4% withdrawal rate, it adds $5,600 a year in spending capacity. That's $466 a month, roughly the equivalent of one reasonably nice dinner out per week. The one more year trade is this. You give up one entire year of your early, fully capable retirement in exchange for the ability to afford about one additional dinner per week for the rest of your retirement. That's the arithmetic. One researcher summed it up this way. If you continue working past the point of financial independence, you're incurring an opportunity cost. At that stage, the extra wealth you're stacking up is outweighed by the shrinking number of good years left to enjoy it. And remember, people rarely do one more year just once. From what I've read and observed, individuals stuck in this loop typically work somewhere between 2 and 5 years past their true independence number before they finally step away. Let's use a conservative middle case, 3 years. 3 repeated one more year decisions, starting from genuine financial independence, end up consuming about 20% of your active retirement window. Not 20% of your life. 20% of the time when you're healthiest and most able to live out what you've been saving for. Two psychological forces drive this, and neither is fixed by simply having more money. The first is loss aversion, documented thoroughly in Daniel Kahneman's research. Humans feel the pain of possible loss roughly twice as strongly as the pleasure of a similar gain. When you think about retirement, especially the fear of running out of money, a market crash in year 2, or inflation outpacing your assumptions, your brain stacks the downside as much heavier than any equivalent upside. So if you're relying on your feelings to decide when enough is enough, you will overshoot every time. You can't intuit your way to the right number. You need a structure that removes that emotional distortion. The second force is what I'll call the income ratchet. Every additional year you earn a high income, your normal spending baseline drifts higher. That pushes up your idea of what comfortable retirement requires. It ratchets in only one direction. Each year you work past your independence point, you're not just sacrificing time. You're also raising the psychological bar for what feels like enough. The version of you who stops at 58 has a lower lifestyle floor than the version who keeps working until 63 and gets used to that higher burn rate. That's why one more year never resolves the anxiety. It feeds it. There's also a third, rarely discussed dimension. The later you retire, the more difficult the transition can be psychologically and socially. Your identity, your routine, your sense of purpose, all of these are more malleable in your late 50s and early 60s than in your late 60s. Research on adaptability and cognitive flexibility suggests people in that earlier phase are better equipped to design a new life around non-work priorities. Retiring earlier doesn't just buy you more time. It buys you more capacity and energy to shape that time intentionally instead of just trying to fill it. The meter is running, and not all of the time on it has the same quality. Now we reach the turning point of this discussion because up to now we've focused on costs, the time sacrificed, the window reduced, the traps you can stumble into. But what about the main reason people give for delaying retirement? The stated rationale is almost always some version of, I need more cushion. I want protection against markets. I want to be sure I never run out. That sounds sensible. And there is one specific risk that working additional years does help with. The problem is there's another risk, arguably the most important one in retirement income planning, that extra work years barely touch. Most people have the priority order reversed. The risk that extra working years truly help with is longevity risk. The danger that you outlive your money. More contributions and more time invested usually mean a bigger portfolio, which means your withdrawals draw down slower. And the money has a better chance of lasting through a long life. Fair point. But here's the risk that staying on the job does almost nothing about: sequence of returns risk. Navigating what's often called the retirement risk zone, The 5 to 10 years just before and just after you retire is the single most critical part of building a resilient plan. Here's how it plays out. Imagine two retirees. Both stop working the same year. Each has a $1 million portfolio with the same mix of investments, the same average annual return over 30 years, say 7%, and the same withdrawal pattern, taking out $50,000 a year. The only difference is what markets do in the first year of their retirement. Investor A hits a strong bull market early. For the first 5 years, returns are great. The portfolio grows faster than withdrawals shrink it. By year 10, the account is still robust and the numbers feel safe. Investor B steps into a sharp downturn instead. The market falls 30% in year 1. They still need $50,000 to live, so they sell at depressed prices, locking in the loss. Now, the portfolio has to recover from a smaller base while ongoing withdrawals keep pulling money out. Fidelity's research shows that if a retiree starts with $1 million, pulls $50,000 annually, and experiences strong early returns, the money can last well over 30 years. But if poor returns hit early, even followed by a long bull market, that same portfolio could run dry in 27 years. Same average return. 8-year difference in sustainability. Even more striking, for someone who suffers a major market shock right at retirement, the chance their portfolio fails was calculated at 50.6% versus 33.5% if the exact same shock happens 15 years later. Timing beats balance size. Morningstar's 2025 analysis concluded that retirees who encounter bad returns in the first 5 years and don't adjust their spending are far more likely to deplete their savings prematurely. That's sequence of returns risk. It's the biggest threat to any withdrawal plan, no matter the initial percentage. So what does this imply about the work extra for safety strategy? You could grind away until 68, grow a $1.2 million portfolio into, say, $1.6 million, and feel invincible. Then you retire straight into a bear market and find yourself dangerously exposed by year 12 anyway. Yes, a larger balance gives you a bit more breathing room against sequence risk, but it doesn't fix the underlying issue. You can't control what markets do in your first year of retirement. The tools that actually help with sequence risk aren't more years at your job. They're structural choices. They are cash and near cash reserves, 1 to 2 years of expenses held outside your volatile investments, so you can avoid selling stocks when they're down. They are a cushion of bonds or other lower volatility assets at retirement that you gradually taper off as you move past the riskiest window. They are flexible withdrawal rules, spending a bit less in down markets, a bit more in strong markets, instead of a rigid fixed percentage that ignores reality. Those are the mechanisms that address the risk at its source. Meanwhile, many advisors charging 1% of your assets annually, often while only explaining half of what actually matters, have built-in incentives to keep you in accumulation mode, not to help you engineer a clean exit. The moment you retire with a defined plan and manage your own withdrawals intelligently, you might question whether you still need a 1% asset under management relationship. The incentive structure is almost darkly comic, but you should see it clearly. A 1% fee on $200,000 over 30 years at 7% average returns costs you about $173,000 in lost compounding. That's not a rounding error. That's a second car in the driveway amount of potential wealth gone. The mainstream financial planning script reads the same almost everywhere. Max your 401k, work until 67, retire on the 4% rule. That 4% rule, by the way, was developed in 1994 using historical data from a different market era than the one we're facing now. Yet it's still treated as a law of nature. Let's circle back to David, the 54-year-old senior director we started with. We already saw version 1 of his story, caught off guard by a layoff at 57, scrambling, retiring at 61 with fewer resources than planned. But there's an alternate version. In that version, David at 53 sits down and runs the active years math. He looks at his accounts and realizes he's closer to his independence number than he'd assumed. The marginal value of 3 more years of pounding away at full-time work isn't worth the cost of surrendering 3 prime early retirement years. He redesigns his plan around the 58% reality that it's more likely than not he'll be pushed out early. He builds a buffer so that if he's forced out at 57, his plan doesn't shatter. He integrates sequence risk management into his withdrawal strategy instead of simply relying on having a bigger pot. When the layoff hits at 57, version 2 David isn't panicking. He has a defined number. He has a structure. He already accounted for this possibility because the data said it was likely. The gap between these two Davids isn't intelligence and it isn't affluence. It's whether they built a one-dimensional plan or a two-dimensional one. Let's walk through a real-world example. Call him Marcus. He's 48, lives in the Midwest, and his household brings in $140,000 a year. Between his and his spouse's retirement accounts, they've accumulated $850,000. They have $70,000 in a taxable brokerage account and own their home outright. Their annual spending is about $65,000. When Marcus runs the classic calculation, he multiplies his spending by 25 to apply the 4% rule. That gives him a target of $1.625 million to sustain $65,000 annually. Right now, he sits at $920,000. He sees a shortfall of about $705,000, including taxable funds. His first thought, work until 62, another 14 years. He figures he'll keep contributing heavily, assume 7% returns, and reach the target comfortably. Now let's run the two-dimensional calculation. At his current savings rate and assuming 7% annual growth, his portfolio actually hits around $1.66 million at age 55. 7 years from now, not 14. He has been mentally married to 62 simply because that was his old plan, and he hasn't updated his math in several years. Those 7 extra working years come with a specific cost. At 48, in good health, if he retires at 62, his 14-year active retirement window will run roughly from 62 to 76. If he recalibrates his target to 55, his 14-year active window runs from 55 to 69. Same number of high-quality years, but they're a different slice. Younger, more physical capacity, more options. He also gains a buffer. If he builds around 55 and gets laid off at 53, he's only 2 years away from the plan, not a decade. He has margin instead of vulnerability. The extra money he'd accumulate by working from 55 to 62, roughly $900,000 at 7% growth, would give him an additional $36,000 per year at a 4% withdrawal rate. That's a significant bump. But spending data on retirees show that real spending typically falls across retirement. The extra dollars show up when his natural willingness and ability to spend aggressively has already dropped. He is working hard and sacrificing premium years to fund a phase when he may be mostly sitting, not doing. When we run the numbers with both currencies, dollars and years, his real optimal retirement age lands closer to 57, assuming a reasonable buffer for sequence risk and flexible withdrawals. That's 2 years beyond 55 for safety, but 7 years earlier than 62, buying a substantial expansion of his active retirement window.